Hello everyone, welcome to part B of the introduction to pharmacokinetic 1. So firstly what we're going to talk about is the pharmacokinetic process. There are 4 processes: it's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So firstly it's absorption. In order for a drug to produce a therapeutic effect, it must be absorbed into the bloodstream and into the systemic circulation or into the bloodstream, which is quite logic. Drugs can cross cell membranes through 4 ways. First is passive diffusion, then it's facilitated passive diffusion, then it's pinocytosis, and then as well as active transport. So that's the 4 ways. So passive diffusion is the most common, and it is when drugs move or molecules move from a highly concentrated area to a low concentrated area, so therefore with the concentration gradient. Facilitated passive diffusion is the same as diffusion, it's just there has to be a carrier mediated molecule bound, but also no energy required or anything like that. So it's the same, just the molecule that needs to bind. Then pinocytosis is just literally when the cell engulfs a molecule. This normally happens with the fat-soluble vitamins such as A, D, E, and K, but it can also play a small role in the drug transport. Then active transport, such as the words indicates that it's active, so it requires energy in the form of ATP. It's also very scarce, doesn't really happen a lot, so molecules can be moved from a low concentration to a high concentration. Okay, so what I'm going to say now is very important, is that the plasma membrane of a cell consists of a lipid bilayer. Therefore, if you administer drugs, that drug should be lipid soluble so that it can diffuse through the lipid bilayer. And therefore, lipid soluble drugs are non-ionized drugs or non-polar drugs or non-charged drugs. So all synonyms. So therefore, you need to administer non-ionized or non-polar drugs so that the drug can diffuse through the lipid bilayer and into through the plasma membrane and the cell membrane. Okay, and then the surface area is very important as well. That's why most of the drugs will be absorbed in the intestine, because it's the most surface area, about 200 square meters of surface area in the intestine. And then also, I wrote it down here, is that non-ionized drugs, they are lipid soluble and they can diffuse through the plasma membrane or diffuse through the lipid bilayer. Whereas ionized drugs, they are polar, they are water soluble and they can't diffuse through the lipid bilayer, so it means they can't be absorbed or distributed for that matter. So the more lipid soluble or non-ionized a drug is, the easier it diffuses through the lipid bilayer and easier it can get absorbed. Okay, then also the pKa value. The pKa value is the value where 50% of the drug is ionized and 50% of the drug is non-ionized. Okay, so the take-home message about absorption and distribution for that matter is that it needs to be a non-ionized drug in order to diffuse through the lipid bilayer in order for absorption and distribution to take place. Okay. So a very important factor as well that has an impact on the distribution is the amount of drugs bound to plasma proteins. It's very important to note that if a drug is bound to a plasma protein, it means that that drug is not active anymore, which means it doesn't have a therapeutic effect. So the amount of drug bound to a protein will be affected by 3 factors. 1 is the protein concentration, 2 is the drug concentration, and 3 is the affinity to the binding sites. This will have the most effect on the amount of drugs bound to plasma proteins. And 2 plasma proteins that binds drugs are albumin and B globulin. So Drugs with a high lipid solubility can easily penetrate fat stores and cross membrane barriers for broader distribution. So the more lipid soluble a drug is, the broader the distribution. Also, water soluble drugs can be easily eliminated from the body. This is very important in metabolism and elimination, which is coming next, is that water soluble drugs can easily be eliminated from the body. And fat soluble drugs can also be stored for longer lasting effects. Okay, so the next one, the third step, is metabolism or biotransformation. So this is where the medication or the drugs is turned into metabolites. But what metabolism aims to do is to break down the lipid-soluble drugs into water-soluble metabolites in order for easier excretion. And the primary site where metabolism takes place is in the liver, but it also occurs in the kidneys, GI tract, and the lungs. So when a drug is metabolized, it can be inactive, it can be less active, it can be more active, then you call it a prodrug. It can be more toxic, and it can be the same as the parent drug. So drug metabolism, also very important, is drug metabolism aims to break down a lipid-soluble drug into a water-soluble metabolite. And there's two phases, the first phase and the second phase. The first phase is oxidation, reduction, hydrolysis, and also the cytochrome P450 enzyme, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And then also phase 2 is a conjugation. So conjugation is also important in the next slides. Also wrote here, the ultimate effect is to make the metabolite as water-soluble as possible for easy excretion. So yeah, to break down a lipid-soluble drug into a water-soluble metabolite. Okay, so coming back to the CYP450, the cytochrome P450 enzyme, is these enzymes catalyzes the oxidation of many drugs. So then phase 1, it catalyzes the oxidation. So it plays a critical role in metabolism. But different drugs can affect the cytochrome P in different ways. Some drugs can be inducers and some drugs can be inhibitors. This is also very important because if you administer a drug that is an inducer, this could mean that there will be more cytochrome P450 enzymes, therefore more of the drug will be metabolized, which means more of the drug will be inactive and the therapeutic effect might not be reached. Whereas if you administer some of the drugs which are inhibitors, this could mean that that not enough drugs is broken down into metabolites, which means that the drug can be toxic for that person. So it's also very, in BNB, it's very important to know these drugs, the inducers and inhibitors. And then there's also something called the enterohepatic circulation, which I also said the conjugation, which we can talk now. This is when the drugs are, or the drugs are into the liver through the systemic circulation, and then through phase 1 through oxidation, reduction, and what was the other one? Oxidation, reduction, and hydrolysis, and even the cytochromic P450 enzyme. The drugs are broken down into metabolites in the phase 1. But in phase 2, conjugation occurs, which means that metabolites are brought back together, and then the drug can form and the drug can be distributed into the intestines once again. So then it's just like a circle from drug to metabolite to drug again. Yeah, so that's the enterohepatic circulation. Then moving on to the elimination, which occurs mostly in the kidneys. The elimination can be through urine, bile, to the lungs, sweat, milk, saliva, and feces. The kidney is mainly responsible for drug elimination, as I just said. There's also 3 ways. for renal elimination. The first one is glomerular filtration. This is when molecules are very small, below 200 kDa, to pass into the filtrate. And the drug must be free, not protein bound, because when it's protein bound, it's a macromolecule and it's too big to move into the filtrate. Then you get also active tubular secretion. This happens in the convoluted tubule. The transport drugs out of the blood into the urine. Then you also get tubular reabsorption. It can be active or passive and takes place in the proximal convoluted tubular of the nephron. Yeah, so that's a reabsorption of the drug. That's also when you want the drug to be non-ionized, which means lipid soluble. But in the other two, in the glomerular filtration and the active tubular secretion, you want the drug to be non-ionized, which means water soluble. So yeah, it's also the take-home messages. In the absorption and distribution phase, you want the drugs to be non-ionized, non-polar, non-charged, so that they are lipid soluble and they can diffuse through the lipid bilayer. But in the elimination and the metabolism phase, you want the drugs to be ionized, which means polar or charged, so that they are water soluble, so that they can be easily eliminated. But in the tubular reabsorption in the elimination phase, you want the drug to be non-ionized, so that it's also lipid soluble. So yeah, I hope this makes sense. And yeah, thank you for watching my video, and like and subscribe, and yeah, cheers.